You know that in about 10 days, the season of Lent is going to begin. And you know, the three pillars of Lent are three practices: prayer, fasting, almsgiving. And perhaps when we come to Lent, you know, two most popular questions that people will ask you perhaps is, what is that smudge on your forehead? Because people who have no idea, or people who are not Catholic, or certain churches of Christianity will not understand what the season of Lent or what Ash Wednesday is about. But the other question, which is popular among Catholics, is what are you giving up for Lent? So, you know, most of the times people who smoke might say cigarettes. People who eat might say they're giving up chocolate or candy. People who like to drink may say they're giving up alcohol. What's the rationale? What's the reason to do this? So people who said they're not going to eat chocolate or giving up dessert or not going to drink during Lent, if their rationale is to lose weight, well, I don't think that's really quite the best reason. That might be a side reason, a third or fourth reason, but it shouldn't be the first reason. Now, none of you guys have to worry about that. Only Father Dominic has to worry about that. The rationale for these practices in the season of Lent, first of all, these are acts of love to make a sacrifice for someone you love and who loves you in return. So by thinking about the sacrifice of Jesus in his life on the cross, in the passion and death, then we think, okay, you know, Jesus loved us that much. How can I show my love in return? So we may say, I'm going to give up certain things for the season of Lent. All right, and that's a good rationale. But I think there's another rationale that is just as important and perhaps more so, and maybe it's the other side of the same coin. But part of the rationale of doing penance in Lent is to think about your own life and to consider one of the weaknesses or vices that you have, something that keeps you from loving God and the people around you more fully. And how can you change that? How can you change a vice into a good habit? Now, you may have heard it said that people make resolutions on New Year's and they keep them for 11 days. And January 11th, I forget what they call it. It's the quit day, because most people's resolutions last 11 days and that's it. Well, what we'd like to do in the season of Lent is try to define a good habit that is going to keep past the 40 days of Lent. Some psychologists say it takes about 2 months to break a bad habit and to form a new good habit. And so if you take 40 days of Lent, you're already on your way to developing a good habit if you not only try to break the bad one, but replace it with a good one. So keeping that in mind, then we can look and see, well, what is the Salesian way of penance? And I'll tell you a story that some of you may have heard about Dominic Savio. And some of you know who Dominic Savio is. If you don't, Dominic Savio was a boy at the school of Don Bosco at the Oratory in Turin. And he is a canonized saint, and he was a pupil at Don Bosco school. So we have Saint Dominic Savio. When you come to Salesian High in New Rochelle, you can see a big painting of him on the wall of our chapel. But you know, Don Bosco would give a talk every night called the Good Night to the boys who lived at the oratory school. And one night he was talking about, as he did many times, that the need for the boys of the oratory to become saints. And so Dominic Savio listened very intently. He was only 14 years old. He listened very intently to what Don Bosco was saying about this need to become a saint. And so he took to heart these words, and he was going to do his best to live them out. And a few days after the good night, Don Bosco met Dominic Savio in one of the corridors. And Dominic Savio was looking like this. His face is downcast. He's looking sad. He's not smiling. And Don Bosco stops Dominic and says, "Dominic, what's the matter?" And Dominic says, "I'm trying to become a saint." And Don Bosco takes Dominic by the chin and lifts his chin up and says, "Dominic, I'm going to tell you two things. The way to become a saint in my house, the first thing you must be is that you must be cheerful. That's the first rule, to be cheerful as often as possible. That's how you become a saint, by the way you look at the world, not from a downcast point of view, but cheerfulness is necessary." I mean, I think that's a little strange, but if you go to Mass on Ash Wednesday and you listen to the gospel, which is in Matthew chapter 6, verses, well, these are the two verses that are most important. "When you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites. They neglect their appearance so that they may appear to others to be fasting. Amen, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that you may not appear to be fasting, except to your Father who is hidden. And your Father who sees what is hidden will repay you." You're not going to become a saint by looking gloomy and dejected and having that type of attitude. So that's the first thing Don Bosco said to Dominic. The first rule in my house is to be cheerful. The second thing that Don Bosco said is you become a saint by doing, and this is what I say to our young men here at Salesian a lot of times, doing what you're supposed to do at the time you're supposed to do it. Now that may sound easy and sort of like as a given, but stop and think about it for a minute. How many times in our own lives, no matter how young or not young we may be on this Zoom call, do we decide to do the things that we're not supposed to do at the times we're not supposed to do them? So Don Bosco says to Dominic, he says, so when it's time to play, play. When it's time to pray, pray. When it's time to study, study. When it's time to do your chores, do your chores. And don't try to substitute them with something else. So, you know, Dominic, who was holy enough to become a saint, but Don Bosco told him, you don't become that way by spending your whole time in the chapel. You're 14 years old. You need to do what 14-year-olds do in the best possible way. To try to excel at your studies, to be out in the courtyard or in the playground when it's time for recreation, to pray as best you can when it's time to pray. And when it's time to go to bed, you know, you go to bed and don't sneak the iPhone under your pillow. Don Bosco, Dominic, who when he was in this mode, thought that, well, the only way I can become a saint is by doing extraordinarily hard penances. And Don Bosco said, no, Dominic, you cannot do those, you cannot do extraordinary or unusual penances. So, you know, if you go to Turin some days, as Father Tim has done many times, you will find out that Turin is in the Alps. The winters are cold. If you think Notre Dame is cold, maybe cold, Turin is pretty cold also, and there's snow and biting wind as well. So Dominic thought he would perform a penance by using only a sheet instead of a blanket over him. Don Bosco says, you cannot do that. You will ruin your health. Another thing that Dominic did was he put, the mattresses were not very thick. So Dominic put stones under his mattress so that he would purposely be uncomfortable when he was trying to sleep at night. And Don Bosco said, no, you cannot do that because that is not good for your health. Those are extraordinary things. Do the ordinary things in the best possible way. And so when we think about this, in our own Salesian rule, it says to us, the Constitution say to us, Salesians don't look for unusual penances, but we look instead for some aspect of our daily life that needs to be fixed, so to say. I once had a prayer card that said, "Why were the saints saints?" And I don't remember exactly what it said, but this was the reasoning, or this was the explanation. Why were the saints saints? Because they were patient when they wanted to be angry. They were kind when they wanted to be nasty. They were silent when they wanted to gossip. And then it went on like that. What is the penance that we have to carry out? The ordinary penance is to practice the virtue when we want to do the vice. And again, that may seem easy until you actually get in the spot and you realize how difficult this may actually be. When you want to make that biting comment about somebody because you think it's going to get a laugh, and instead you keep your mouth shut. When you would rather not do the chore that your parents have asked you to do or that you know you need to do, and that I'm going to do it. When you don't want to do that trigonometry homework, but of course Tin always wants to do that. And you want to procrastinate and wait until later on, so while you're playing Xbox for another hour first, but you know you should be doing your trig homework. Put the Xbox aside and do the trig homework. Even though you're supposed to do it, that becomes a penance because you're putting aside the thing you'd rather do for the thing that may be more difficult or harder. We also see this, another example of a person who did this was St. Francis de Sales. And St. Francis de Sales, Don Bosco chose to be the patron of the oratory and of the society that he started. One of the things about St. Francis de Sales is that he had a terrible temper. He could blow up at the drop of a hat. And purposely, de Sales it took him 20 years to bring this terrible temper under control. The type of mortification or penances he must have done, all the times he wanted to say something but didn't. And one day, somebody came to the door, somebody who had offended him, and somebody came to the door, and Francis de Sales opened the door, and his assistant priest was with him. And Francis de Sales treated this man with kindness and patience, and then sent him on his way. And Francis de Sales' assistant said, "But Bishop, that man offended you. You really should have given him what for?" And Francis de Sales says, "Should I lose in a minute what it took me 20 years to develop?" And so, changing that habit and keeping that habit and not getting angry or saying vulgar words, unkind words, even if sometimes they might be deserved, is the type of penance that as Salesians and as Salesian young people, we are being asked to follow. Pope Francis says the same thing in many places. And last year in Lent, I haven't seen anything for this year, but last year in Lent, he talked about two things. One, refrain from gossip. You want to tell stories about somebody else, refrain from talking about somebody else. Refrain from telling stories that aren't true. Sometimes we've heard something and we cannot wait to tell the first person we see about something that we don't know if it's true or not. I was saying at the table the other day, even though this is not gossip, back in 2013, I was at Don Bosco residence in Orange, and it was the day that Pope Benedict XVI resigned. None of us knew it, except that one of the brothers there made it an intention at morning prayer. He said, "We pray for the health of Pope Benedict XVI, who just resigned." Well, nobody in the community knew it, and all of a sudden the whole chapel was abuzz about, did this really happen? Did he resign? Or was this brother just pulling our leg? He couldn't wait to be the first one to let the rest of the community know that this actually happened. And while that wasn't gossip, and Travis, you were there, you remember that, I think. But still, I couldn't wait. I couldn't control myself. I had to do this at this particular time. So that's one of the things Pope Francis talks about is refrain from gossip. The other thing that Pope Francis was big on last year and other times too, refrain from social media and refrain from trolling. I've met any number of people who have the good intention of only being on Instagram or Facebook or Snapchat or Twitter for a half hour. And before they know it, the whole night is gone because they spent 3 hours trolling on social media. And then they say, oh my gosh, I haven't done anything I'm supposed to do. So a penance then is to say, either to say 30 minutes or whatever the time is, and that's it, or I will refrain from social media for the season of Lent. And I have several friends who say, it's Ash Wednesday, see you in 40 days. But I think part of Salesian penance is taking something in our lives that needs improving for the sake of loving God and the people around us more fully and more faithfully. And that is the penance that we are called to follow.